who is a former NYPD lieutenant. He worked internal affairs, and he has also taught criminal law, and he has testified as a criminal law witness. How are you today, sir?
I'm good, and thanks for having me, Dane. As always, it's a pleasure to appear with you.
It's great to have you because I think you have so much experience from not only being on the street as a policeman and spending, I think, 20 years in the NYPD. You can correct me there if I'm wrong on the number, but you've also talked a lot about police reform, and you've appeared on a lot of programs lately in the U.S. to talk about what's going on, and it's such an important debate now within the United States. Let's go to Louisville because, as you know, that's where the headlines are. First of all, you have the Breonna Taylor case, Breonna Taylor case from March. This is a young woman who was shot when police did a no-knock search warrant on her apartment. One police officer entered. There was a hail of bullets, and she, who got up out of bed, was shot, I think, 5 or 6 times and killed. And then now you have had the state attorney this week announcing that there are no charges against the 3 police officers, and that has really, Darren, as you know, reignited the street. Is it reasonable that no criminal charges in terms of murder charges were brought against all 3 or any of those 3 policemen?
Well, I can give it to you from 2 perspectives. The first component is we need to look at the grand jury proceeding as to what it is. It's a closed-door proceeding. So as a result of it being a closed-door proceeding, there's information that's introduced into the equation that we may not be privy to as the public. So what we've heard up to this point, one of the things, the charge that the officer who was subsequently terminated in the summertime by the interim police chief was, it was wanton. I forget what the charge was, but in any event, it was not. It was wanton endangerment, which is
wanton endangerment. Yeah,
right. Which
is what, by the way,
which is lower. It's basically you put. There was a fear of danger, or I should say, you put others at risk when you perceive that there was a danger attributed to your actions. That's kind of what it was. And the wanton endangerment was connected with the shots that were fired by the officer that struck the, I want to say, the residence that was next door. But none of the charges ran consistent with the death of Breonna Taylor. So that being said, I'm speaking from a tertiary perspective in that the information that I have is not any and everything that was laid out in the grand jury proceeding. From my understanding, this was a no-knock warrant. However, the officers did. I'm sorry,
All right, if you're just joining.
No, I apologize.
We are live with Dr. Darren Porcher in New York. And Darren is a former member of the NYPD, a former lieutenant who was also assigned to work internal affairs, and that's the department which investigates other police and police actions in the NYPD. He is also now a professor at Pace University, and he is an expert on criminal law. Sorry, Darren, go ahead with what you were saying about the charges against the one officer.
All right, my sincerest apologies, but what happened with the officer, he was charged with wanton endangerment. And that was basically, he placed the individuals in danger that lived next door, so to speak. And the reason was because the officer fired in an area that he was unsure if there was a potential threat located. This was behind a curtain, so to speak. However, there were no charges in connection with the death of Breonna Taylor. Now, one may argue that, look, you know what, we had a situation where Breonna Taylor was asleep in her residence and the police merely came in with a no-knock warrant and she subsequently lost her life. That's an argument. There's another argument that can be, this was not, although the warrant had no-knock status, announced their presence prior to entering. So, the boyfriend stated
right, and there was a lot of, that was contested as to how many times did they actually announce themselves at the door, and were they really identified as police before going into the apartment? And that was part of some of the things that were heard in the grand jury, which we won't know until a trial takes place.
Right, and it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. We're speaking from a tertiary perspective and not empirical evidence that we have a direct line of continuous information coming from. So, in any event, that being said, the argument that I think is the overarching argument that people in the public are introducing is a disproportionately higher number of police fatalities connected with the deaths of African Americans in connection with how they're dealing with police. And this is something that goes to as recently the death of George Floyd. We saw a social movement here in the United States that's been somewhat in opposition to police, and it was requesting police reform. I'm a firm proponent in police reform should be something that's necessary in society, and it should be always revolving. The evolution in police reform should always remain consistent. We shouldn't reach a plateau and say we're good here.
Darren, because you know that that's igniting the street, right? And people feel that they should have been charged with murder. Do you think, at the very least, it probably would have been better to put it to a jury, that not a grand jury in a private behind the closed door session? And I understand that as a process in the U.S. towards arriving at charges, but do you think it should have gone to an open jury so that people would know what the evidence was and whether justice was done? Because right now, the black community certainly doesn't feel that justice is being done in that case.
Well, the natural order of justice is here in the United States is a case is presented to the grand jury, and depending upon what the grand jury outcome is, it'll be an indictment. We commonly refer to it as a true bill, so to speak. So if an officer or any individual for that matter is indicted, all that simply means is there's enough information that's credible to move forth to a criminal trial. If the grand jury believed that there wasn't credible information to move forth to a criminal proceeding, then we would not have an indictment. But it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. We're not privy to the information that was introduced into the grand jury. The state attorney general made statements in connection with the same. He said, look, you know what? There's a lot of this that I'm not going to introduce to the public because it can be of detriment to the criminal proceeding moving
forward. Were you surprised? Because, I mean, a lot of people think that this is just, injustice in the South again. Were you surprised because you know the case? Were you surprised that at least one of them wasn't charged with murder? This is an innocent woman. I mean, there's no criminal allegation against her. Innocent woman shot by police, coming in the door on a no-knock warrant. I understand now that they've now banned no-knock warrants, I think. A no-knock warrant essentially is in these drug cases where people flush drugs down the toilet and they don't want to give them much time. They want to hit the door and go in and seize the drugs and get the evidence. That's the point of a no-knock warrant, isn't it?
Well, it's multifaceted. The reason why a no-knock provision is allowed within warrants is because there can be several things. One, there could be a danger to the officer, such as there's possibly weapons that can be prevalent at the scene of where the officers are doing their warrant, or it can be the destruction of evidence. So once again, it's somewhat multifaceted in terms of why a judge would issue or allow a no-knock status. But when we look at the situation,
but regardless, in this case, the judge decided that they had enough evidence to have a warrant and a no-knock warrant, and the policeman went to that door. The other two policemen stood outside, and once the suspect of that warrant fired one shot at the policeman, hitting him in the leg, I believe, or the thigh, then they started opening fire as well, and you had, I think 36 bullets go in that apartment.
Well, Dana, the person that fired at the officer was not the suspect. That person wasn't named in the warrant. He just so happened to be at Breonna Taylor's residence. He was her current boyfriend.
Forgive me,
he was the
boyfriend. He was not.
So he was not named in the warrant. But it goes back to the information that I'm receiving and everyone else is receiving is tertiary information, because the initial narrative that came out was the police were at the wrong residence and executed a search warrant and Breonna Taylor lost her life. That proved to be a falsehood. The second component was there was this warrant against specific to Breonna Taylor's ex-boyfriend. And that wasn't true. Breonna Taylor was drawn up in the tenets of the search warrant. Her name was listed. So we're speaking from a place of conjecture, and more importantly, I
Well, I
think
mean,
that
it's
I'm
not, we
sorry.
have to speak from conjecture, don't we? Because we have to move outside the realm of legal technicalities here and really talk about how is justice going to be seen to be done in this case. And it's probably never going to be seen to be done.
Well, I mean, that remains to be seen. I just think that we need a comprehensive investigation to assess the tenets of why this incident occurred. And I can speak to my past experience as a practitioner in an internal affairs bureau, which was when I was a lieutenant in the NYPD's internal affairs bureau. Oftentimes, when you have these types of incidents, you have multiple narratives that are introduced, and it's important that you find what actually occurred. So when you find out what actually occurred, that in essence is recovering justice. There is an attorney attached to it, which I believe is Benjamin Crump. He is the civil attorney that's been retained by the family.
Mhm.
He is going to have more privy, he's going to be more privy to information that will support his client moving forward. And his information source is going to be very different than the information source that's been introduced in the media. So when you speak to justice being served, I believe that there's already something in motion. Case in point, $12 million has since been awarded to the estate of Breonna Taylor. So that in itself states that there is something moving in a direction to, I don't want to say.
Right, some kind of civil action will take place, and as it will in the George Floyd case and in many of these other cases. Look, let's talk about what's happening on the street. First of all, policemen who are trying to protect property in these demonstrations, which are largely, by the way, peaceful. I mean, I think we have to say that over and over again. A lot of these demonstrations that have taken place in American cities are peaceful demonstrations, but policemen who are there to protect the property because some buildings have been burned down, there has been violence. I mean, increasingly, a lot of these policemen are now the victims of violence themselves. I mean, you have two policemen who were shot in Louisville the other night. It's pretty disturbing.
Going back to peaceful, I want to give you an example. People stated that the demonstrations or the protests in Louisville were mostly peaceful. We had two officers that were shot. We had property damage to innocent business owners. So once you have situations where people are shot, especially police
Right.
officers or civilians, in my eyes, it's a violent protest. You can say that
Right.
the
At night, it
protest
turned
ran.
into a violent protest, but during the day, it was largely peaceful.
Yeah, but once again, it's something that it's something that metastasized to being violent. And what happens is a lot of people are not realizing there's a community that's under siege, whether it's the business owners or whether they're people that are being injured in these communities. They have a voice, and I find in many of these demonstrations, their voices are being drowned out. They are the silent majority. The loud minority is the narrative that we hear. So when we have police officers being shot, we have businesses being burned down. I think that it's necessary for us to do something. I'm in wholehearted agreement for a peaceful protest, provided it falls within the purview of the First Amendment. Martin Luther King never fired a shot at anyone. He never threw a brick at a police officer, and he never burned down a business. And this is subsequently proved to be fruitful for these communities. So when I look at a lot of these protests, I'm in wholehearted agreement that look, a protest should be sound and people have a right to voice their opinion, but it needs to fall within the purview of not harming other people.
I agree completely, and you know, I don't. I agree with you completely. I mean, I think peaceful demonstrations, and I think probably my voice is a bit louder than yours in terms of I think most of them have been peaceful, but there have been incidents, and then I think the most of the public in America will support then a stronger arm on the street by police to protect property and to protect other people in that area. Are you amazed, like, for instance, Portland, day by day by day? This has been going on since the killing of George Floyd. Why can they not put out the fire there? And maybe they don't need to, but the damage to buildings has taken place, and Molotov cocktails have been thrown, which, by the way, I mean, that is not a normal peaceful demonstration. When you start throwing Molotov cocktail in the area of demonstrators and in the area of policemen who are protecting buildings, I mean, that's getting pretty violent again.
Well, I mean, I have a problem with that as well. And I just say that what I've seen, granted, in Portland is a very different dynamic. I want to say what's happening in Portland for 100 plus days is somewhat reflective of what we've seen in Seattle. There's been a social outrage, but at the same token, a lot of, just picture, Dana, if you were a business owner and you had a reputable establishment that was burned down or torched as a result of a protest that spiraled out of control, you would demand answers like anyone else.
Sure.
Right. So it goes back to, we have a community that is under siege in the wake of a lot of these protests for the failure of the elected officials, and I'm specific to Portland in this particular case, in not providing protections for those business owners. Everyone deserves protections. Now, people say that the police have been out of control and police tactics have subsequently caused irreparable harm to the African American community. I can understand that argument on many fronts. However, we need to channel our anger accordingly. We need to come from a place of progression and not regression. When we look at what's happened over 100 days in Portland, the elected official, being the mayor, has not effectively stemmed the violence and what's happening there. We have counter protesters are now shooting one another, for example. And this is a clear example of, or a hallmark of, something needs to come to fruition, and it needs to come to fruition fast. And it's just not happening. I'm sorry.
I know we don't have a lot of time, so I did want to just cover a couple of quick things with you. First of all, you're in New York. I know you don't speak for the NYPD police union, but why have they come out and supported Donald Trump against Joe Biden in the election, when in fact, you know, Biden has been very outspoken on these demonstrations in terms of saying, I don't support violence. I'll support peaceful demonstrations, but I'm a law and order guy, just like Donald Trump claims he is a law and order guy. Is it fair that the police union jumped in and took the Republican side and are supporting Trump now, when Trump has, to a lot of people's opinion in America and elsewhere, has helped kind of fire some of the fever around the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, versus the, back the blue, support the police line?
Well, I can understand why the police unions would, in many cases, support or endorse Donald Trump moving forth for his re-election campaign. And a lot of that is predicated on the public support that he's voiced in connection with police officers. Now, the other side of the spectrum is Joe Biden. There's not a lot of police unions that are supporting Joe Biden, and the question is why. And one of the things is he just hasn't really maintained a level of support on a public level the way that Donald Trump has. Now, it's, the glass is either half full or the glass is half empty. But this is just something that merely one union is doing. I mean, you have other unions that are doing different things. But this is no more than simply an endorsement for a person that's running for office. And unions specifically support individuals that support the unions. And that's not just in this presidential election, but when you look at mayoral campaigns, when you look at congressional campaigns, it's one and the same. Therefore, this is really no different.
Well, it's going to be very interesting what happens in the debate next week, because along with COVID-19 and foreign policy, policing, and race relations in America is going to be really big. Can you address really quickly, Darren, the increase in crime, or people call it a surge in crime since the killing of George Floyd, probably a bit before that as well. That they're simply shooting and homicide rates there's a wave of them in America.
Well, there has been a meteoric rise in violent crime in America after the death of. There's been a social justice movement that's taken flight in one direction, but a lot of these people that were, I want to say, the core of the social justice movement have been calm and peaceful protesters that are merely speaking to their outrage. But what's happened as a result is you've had agitators or opportunists that have attached to the same movement, and those agitators and opportunists have deemed this as a pathway to commit to other violent acts and atrocities, because the police are used much greater now than ever before in connection with containing these demonstrations and these protests, which means you have a lesser police presence to protect the municipalities and the rural areas. Primarily, this is happening in the larger cities. That's only one
because some of the police have been tasked to dealing with crowd control and
right, but that's right. That's
and then some of them will get defunded. I mean, so
right.
And that money's probably not going to come back for a long time.
Dana, this is a very important part to this. That's one component. The second component is based on the extreme outrage against police. Police have been deemed as the target, so to speak, for people to take out their frustration. So that's why opening up a lane, whereas other criminals, and I want to be specific to this, criminals now feel as if they can act with impunity because the social structure appears diametrically opposed to police. And so from a psychological component, that impunity is driving people to commit to a lot of these acts of gun violence and things to that effect. And it's the most unfortunate part of this is the communities of color that are under siege and are going underrepresented as a result of what's happening.
All right, if you're just joining us, and we're just drawing to a close here, I'm joined. My name is Dana Lewis. I'm the host of Backstory with Dana Lewis podcast, and we're joined by Dr. Darren Porcher, who is a former lieutenant of the NYPD, and he's also worked in internal affairs and teaches criminal law. Excuse me, Darren. Last question: are you concerned now when you see some of these white militias moving about with arms, and they have come into conflict with Black Lives Matter, and there have been shootings? Are you concerned that the police are not taking action against those groups, and that this violence may increase as we near the November election?
I'm concerned whenever we have confrontations between civilians, whether it's armed militia or it's other social groups. And I think that this is really the time of healing as opposed to separating. We've gone through a gross separation in the United States over this year, and nothing has been done to conjoin the entities on both ends. And I think that's what we need to try to do, focus on a plausible solution to bring all parties to a place of harmony as opposed to separation. Is Antifa. I see wrongs on both sides, and this is something that I think is a growing problem and is creating a growing concern as to how can we effectively stem the violence on both ends. And I just don't feel that a plausible solution has been introduced, and therefore we need to have a back channel negotiation to assess what the temperament is of both groups. That way we can come to a realistic agreement, or I should say a realistic solution as to how we can contain the violence on both ends.
I mean, what a incredible time in America. Dr. Darren Porcher, former NYPD lieutenant, worked internal affairs, and he teaches at Pace University, and he's a criminal expert, criminal witness. I'm Dana Lewis with the Backstory podcast. We hope that you can look at that, because Darren and I have talked a number of times on that podcast about issues and defunding and police reform, and there are so many angles, so many layers to all of this. None of it's simple, but I think whenever I get a chance to talk to you, Darren, you know, I think for me and people who listen to you, we come away with some different perspectives, and there is the emotional argument at the beginning of this, I think, whenever these incidents happen, but obviously it is a much more complex discussion when you get into race relations, police abuse, and police reform. So thank you so much for your insight in all of this, Dr. Darren Porcher.
It's always a pleasure, Dana, and thanks for having me.